Hi, I'm Takoa De Silva, and I'm here today with Alex Krainer, founder of Krainer Analytics and publisher of the Trend Compass Reports. Alex, welcome.
Thank you. Very good to be with you, Takoa.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. So I have some questions that I'm very excited to ask you about your background, your perspective on financial commodity markets and geopolitics. But before getting to those items, I want to point out to our viewers that you have just a really great history of social media commentary and interviews on YouTube and your Twitter channel. And what I've noticed is that you have, I think, a really great perspective, which is, I don't know if cynical is the right word, but you have this ability to read through the lines of government propaganda and have very realistic comments. It's refreshing and enjoyable. So the first question I want to ask you is, how did you develop this skill of being able to read between the lines of government propaganda and the translation and deciphering of their messaging?
Very good question, Takoa. It goes back quite a long time. As I mentioned many times in my various newsletters and interviews, I grew up in the communist world, and so the whole idea that the governments would be lying to us for this or that reason around their agendas is something that I got used to already as a teenager. It became quite obvious. And then when I was 17, in 1987, I moved to the United States on a student exchange program. And of course, at the outset, I thought like, wow, well, this system is completely different. This is so much better. But then, with time and over the years, I started picking up the same old, a lot of ideology, a liberal approach to truth, people being sold a bill of goods. And so I became very curious about it, particularly because in the beginning of the 1990s, in the summer of 1991, my own country, former Yugoslavia, fell into something that, could be called a civil war. It wasn't quite that, but, a war of succession, right? And it became obvious that things that were happening on the grounds and the ways in which the media were representing them were so radically at odds that it was clear that we're being lied to. But then, why would the media be lying to us? They're there to report what's going on. And so then you start discerning certain relationships between the state, the actual power structures, the puppet politicians, and the media, which are very clearly not what we're being told that it is. And once you've lived through a war, you can't quite be relaxed about those things and to say like, oh well, they're lying to us, but if I don't rock the boat, maybe I'll be okay. Because then you realize, well, if this was done here, then what could be done in the next generation? And, are we doomed to be always in a permanent state of war? Do our children have to become cannon fodder in some military misadventure? And so, I guess I made it kind of part of my life's calling to try to add my weight to an effort to preserve peace and to prevent our outbreak of greater wars. And so, I started writing and publishing things, and even my day job of being a market analyst and a money manager helped me in this respect, because part of that job is trying to understand what's going on in the world, really going on, not what the newspapers are telling us. So that's how all that came about. It's been a trajectory of the last let's call it 35 years for me.
Alex, you said they're living through war. Can you expand on that a little bit, your personal experience there?
Well, the most fascinating part about this is that I grew up in a country called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia consisted of 6 republics. It was a federation, much like the United States. And the 6 republics were largely based on ethnicity, So there was Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and I don't know if I skipped one. And when let's say that the life in former Yugoslavia was very good. In fact, we lived at peace. We were a relatively prosperous country, and many of these ethnicities in the former, I skipped Bosnia, and Bosnia is a mix of Croatians and Serbs, and also it has a large Muslim minority. And so when during peacetime, people hardly knew who was Serb, who was Croat, who was Muslim, who was Catholic. It just didn't matter, and many of our families were mixed and intertwined. I am myself a child of a mixed marriage between a Croatian father and a Serbian mother. And so at the eve of the war in 1991, I think that probably the vast majority of people, including myself, probably 99% of people, believed that it was absolutely inconceivable that there would be a war between all these people and ethnicities. It felt unthinkable. Yet, once the shooting started, the collective psychology polarized suddenly and almost instantly. And now all of a sudden, from one day to the next, you had the situation where patriotism became a big thing, nationalism became a big thing, taking a nuanced approach to say, well, the other side has a point and maybe the fair thing to do would be this. No, suddenly conduct of the war becomes the nation's obsession from one day to the next. The willingness and ability to fight, to inflict violence becomes almost a virtue. Talking peace becomes suspect. You want to make peace? Are you not patriotic? Do you not want to fight for your country, and so on and so forth? And suddenly you're finding yourself in a completely different climate, and the psychology just changes completely like that. So that was very impressive to me to observe, and it's also very scary. So I think that this is exactly the kind of effect that we need to prevent at this time in history, because I believe that the war in former Yugoslavia was instigated from abroad. It took me pretty much 30 years to work that out, because it wasn't clear at all to us. In the same way that probably many Ukrainians today don't see that connection. They think, okay, well, the Russians invaded, we have to fight to defend our country. But the fact that the war was provoked from abroad, that everything was kind of orchestrated around a certain agenda, that doesn't, that's not at all visible to the people. It's really not discernible at all. And so that transition from, let's say, a peaceful mindset to a war-making mindset, which was almost instant, was that the most fascinating aspect of the experience. And, eventually I volunteered to join the Croatian army, because at a certain point it became clear that, we wouldn't be able to liberate our country other than by force. And, as a young 20-something, I thought, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. I have to do that. That's my patriotic duty. So I did that. But I have to say that at this time, if somebody asked me to volunteer to fight for my country, I wouldn't. And I would advise anybody who finds himself in that situation not to fight, because you're almost certainly being lied to and manipulated. And, as Ernest Hemingway said it, there's a famous quote in which he said that once upon a time it used to be thought sweet and fitting to fight and die for one's country. But in the modern warfare, there's nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. And I think that quote is exactly right. And so for any, Ukrainian, any Israeli, Croatian, Serbian, whatever you want, I might make an exception for the Russians at this time. Fighting and dying for your country is a really dumb idea. Don't do it.
Well, that was my next question: is if you thought that there were circumstances that would be exceptions, but I think you just pointed it out in terms of.
Yeah, I think Russia would be an exception, because Russia has been at the receiving end of wars, invasions, sabotage, regime changes, and so forth from the West for a few centuries now. And I keep changing the number. I say, it was Napoleon and Hitler, and then what happened? The Bolshevik Revolution was a color revolution orchestrated by the West. the 1990s transitions from communism to capitalism, quote unquote, was also orchestrated from the West, and it had very similar effect as an invasion and so forth. So then 1600s Polish invasions, and then there was a Swedish invasion, and so it's been again and again and again. Russia has been at the receiving end from Western powers. So I think that in the case of if I were a Russian, maybe I would feel very different about it, and maybe I would be willing to fight and die for my country. But all the other examples that I'm aware of, no.
Alex, you posted something just really super interesting on July 19th on your Twitter page, which is a post, a quotation from someone named Alex Morton talking about this concept about ants, shaking the jar with black ants and red ants. And I was just reminded of that now as you discussed, what happened in Yugoslavia. Do you think at the time, as you mentioned outside powers, were there forces at work shaking the jar, instigating tensions among the local ethnic groups that you mentioned? And do you see that, more clearly now?
Oh yeah, with the benefit of the hindsight, it's absolutely crystal clear. I do remember, in 1991, I was living in Switzerland, and I was going to the university, and I studied there together with a group of Serbian students, and we were all friends. We got along really well. We visited each other, and they had, they were subscribed to Serbian newspapers and magazines, and I really remember in early 1991, during the winter, that there were the magazines that they were receiving, they were full of stories about Croatian World War II atrocities committed against the Serbs, and the way these articles were written were very incendiary. They were really calculated to induce fear and to kind of prepare the people for conflict. And then, by the spring and summer of 1991, there were as the country was falling apart, the Serbian minority in Croatia felt very threatened, not because they were under any real threat, but because they were convinced that, the World War II type atrocities were going to be inflicted on them by the new Croatian authorities. And then from the other side, we had the immigrants from Canada and Australia in particular who were thrown in. They moved back to Croatia, and they were the most aggressive groups in Croatia calling for war. And then there was a very specific incident that happened when, in areas where Croatian majority and Serbian majority people were living side by side, there were provocations deliberately orchestrated to catalyze an armed conflict. And then there was a Croatian police chief in the Croatian village who sat in a car together with he got in a car together with some of his associates, and they went to drive over to the Serbian area to talk, to make sure that an armed conflict didn't break out. They were on a peace mission. Well, they were intercepted, and they were machine gunned and killed. And at first the media tried to portray it as the Serbs killed them, but they didn't. It was these Canadian immigrants who killed them. So, on the one hand, you had this escalation of fear that was fomented through the media on both sides, but particularly on the Serbian side. And then you also had a very concerted effort to make sure that peace didn't break out, that people didn't, that people fell for the provocations. And so at one point, the war started to happen. The bullets started flying, bombs started exploding. There were victims, there were casualties, and then as I said, the psychology suddenly flipped, and then it was too late. So yeah, it was absolutely this process was absolutely somebody who knew what they were doing, shaking the jar, and the metaphor of the red ants and the black ants just going about their business suddenly turned into, oh my God, something's going on. Well, it's got to be the other, and so let's go and fight. So that's exactly what happened. And I think that today we even know who has turned this process of shaking the jars into science, and we know that it's the stakeholders of the Western Empire. And I like to call it Western Empire because I think it's not accurate to call it an American empire. It's simply a transplant from the undead British Empire that now simply uses American economic, military, diplomatic, and political power to do exactly the same and pursue exactly the same agendas as the British Empire did 100, 200 years ago.
And that analogy that you shared about the ants, that quotation is, with the jar, the black ants and the red ants, they get along just fine when there's no external pressure put on them. But when the jar is shaken violently and I guess dumped out, then the ants start killing each other, I guess, based on the color of the ant. That some researcher discovered this.
Well, yes, they are alarmed. Something terrible happened that they don't understand. They don't know what happened, but I guess it pumps adrenaline into their bloodstream or whatever. I don't know. I'm no ant biologist, but I guess a stress impulse, and now these ants feel like they're maybe under attack, that maybe something is terribly wrong, and they see these other color ants all around them. So they assume, oh my God, we're being attacked, we have to defend ourselves. And I guess that's exactly what happened between the Serbs and Croats, and then later, between Serbs and the Croat and Muslims in alliance, and then, this Croat-Muslim alliance was also broken, very probably by British agents and British UN troops. And so then soon enough, it was everybody against everybody, which makes it easy for those who use divide and conquer approach to policy to manipulate each side and to say like, hey, you attack these people, there might be weapons in it for you, trade deals, credit, and so forth. Then everybody eats out of their hand. And, unfortunately, that's what happened. And the more you know about how other wars erupted, the more you realize it's always the same thing. It's always the same agenda, the same perpetrators, and the same victims to this day. Except, today I have to say, I have to be optimistic. In the 1990s, we were still dependent on newspapers and radio and television for what we knew about the events in the world. And so it was relatively easy for the people in power to control the narrative. Today, it's not so easy anymore because people are receiving real-time information from independent sources. We have, peer-to-peer messaging instantly. And I think that people are no longer reacting in this visceral way anymore, so shaking the jar in the same ways no longer has the same effect. And the thing that I was very afraid of is that the moment any kind of an armed conflict starts between any Western power and Russia, that same polarization would happen again, but now it would be, we'll be looking at an armed conflict between two nuclear powers. And so far, that hasn't happened. And in spite of the fact that the proxy war between Russia and the West has been ongoing in Ukraine for about 30 months now, we haven't had a total escalation. Poland is not in the war, Germany is not in the war, Croatia is not in the war. Practically none of the Western powers other than Ukraine is involved. And I think that that's a cause for optimism.
Alex, I really want to ask you to expand more on that in terms of the European political circumstance at the moment. But before I ask you more about that, if I could quickly ask, so given what you saw in Yugoslavia, I understand there are a lot of people that got killed, and likely a lot of people suffered. But were there circumstances that you recall where people, just regular civilians, did something, took some kind of proactive measure to be able to survive successfully, literally? And then also, were there some circumstances that you recall where some, just regular, ordinary people did things economically to be able to, of course, survive, but then also, thrive, if that's possible in that kind of circumstance?
Well, I think that maybe republics of former Yugoslavia are not the best example for you, because we already had a dysfunctional economy to an extent. The economy of former Yugoslavia was, well, yeah, we could call it dysfunctional in the sense that, during the 1970s and the 1980s, we had inflation, stagflation. Credit allocation was very limited. So, it was all dependent on state entrepreneurship, right? Private entrepreneurship and private property were limited. So you could start your own private company, but there was a limitation on how many employees you could have. It was very difficult if, like you had to finance it from your own pocket or borrow money from your friends, neighbors, family, And so the dysfunctional state controlled economy left a lot of room for emergence of the gray economy. So people already had the habit of exchanging with others. So people went fishing, and then you'd get some fish from your neighbor who went fishing, or they'd come home with 20 kilos of fish. They can't use 20 kilos. They just give it to their neighbor. So there was, the gift economy was very much alive and well, which is what humanity has used for probably 99% of our history on this planet. You always reciprocated. Somebody gave you like a bag full of sausages and potatoes, and then you gave them maybe a jug of 5 gallons of wine or jam or whatever you had. And so let's say these mutual support networks only became more relevant during wartime. And so there was nothing even remotely resembling hunger or food shortages or shortages of anything, really. Everything was throughout the duration of war. The shops, pharmacies were stocked up, hospitals worked, public utilities worked. Everything kind of continued to function normally. In the areas where there were actual fighting and bombardment and things got damaged, well, people who could leave left, and we had internally displaced people that they occupied, hotels and student dormitories. But things were relatively okay from the economic point of view, not in terms of like a burgeoning economy and everybody being very prosperous, but in the sense of people having their necessities met, and these networks of mutual support being very much alive and well. This is now being systematically eroded since we, copy pasted the Western system into our countries, and so now we have these big supermarket chains, and independent farmers and traders are being eliminated in a variety of ways. Inspections. Oh, you didn't do this, you didn't get that certificate. That'll be like a $5 million fine for your 4 chickens coup. And they're being shaken out of the system like that. So we're losing that system of mutual support. But I understand what your question is alluding to, and I think that this is extremely, extremely important. Because having neighbors who can support you and you being able to support your neighbors is I think far and away the most important element of resilience that we have in society, and we're going to have to rebuild that.
Alex, I've heard this conversation for many years about the usefulness of precious metals in those circumstances. Things like coins as well as jewelry. In the type of circumstance that we're discussing now with Yugoslavia, was there usage of those kind of tools in that environment, or was it much more about the basic needs of food and shelter and things like that?
No, we didn't use gold and silver at all. But the equivalent for republics of former Yugoslavia at that time were foreign currencies. So we used a lot of Deutschmarks, German currency, and to a lesser extent Swiss francs. Not so much gold and silver, but in Europe those two currencies were kind of considered reliable store of wealth, and people actually did use them for trading. If you had a second-hand car and you wanted to sell it, you would normally sell it in Deutschmarks. You would not sell it for the local currency. And people had Deutsche Marks, because a lot of people from former Yugoslavia went and worked abroad in places like Germany and Switzerland. And so then they would send money to their family and bring money. And so there was a lot of German currencies circulating in the republics of former Yugoslavia.
So, Alex, we have this, this ongoing conflict now for a few years with Ukraine and Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy, sponsored by the Western Empire. And you also noted that you're feeling some relief because the narrative control is a bit different now, and a lot of people have access to media to find out what's going on. So, how would you describe the political alignment in Europe right now? Is the danger level increasing in your opinion, or is it possibly decreasing because of this, broader awareness, do you think?
Yes, I think that the situation is extremely interesting, and if you read the newspapers, you would get one impression. But if you try to gauge the mood among the people, I get a very different impression. So, this is I think this is Napoleon's quip, where he said that if the government tells the people who their enemy is, you get a war. But if the people work it out for themselves, you get a revolution. And I think that we're exactly in that place now. And so, the media are trying to pump up the fear from visible and invisible enemies. Visible ones being the Russians, who are about to invade us any day. And then the invisible ones are things like, viruses and climate change and things like that. But at the same time, I think that people are working it out for themselves. And I have friends and acquaintances. I live in Monaco. I have friends and acquaintances in France who tell me that what they hear from people who are in the military circles is that they actually fully believe that the current crisis will at some point give rise to a civil war in France. I hear similar things from Germany, where a friend of mine is relatively highly placed in the ADF party, the new German patriotic nationalist party, which in the media they're labeled as extreme right, but they're not extreme right. They're simply German patriots who want Germany for German people, who want Germany to be an independent sovereign nation rather than part of some kind of a globalist agenda. And this person told me that the situation in Germany is at a boiling point. People are literally afraid of their government because the courts, the media, the military, the police, and the security apparatus are all working in concert. He told me that it's kind of like a Gestapo, and when they take somebody on, that their actions are scandalous, that they're illegal. So they're working outside of the bounds of even German law, and they destroy people's lives. And at some point you get a reaction from that. You don't have to look far to know this. That when Nicolae Ceausescu ran a very repressive communist government in Romania, eventually it went badly. So he was in control until he wasn't. And then he and his wife got killed by a firing squad. So these things happen, and apparently, the ruling establishment in Germany is they haven't learned much from history, and they are only taking things farther and farther. I don't know about the other countries, but Germany and France are the most consequential powers in Europe. And if something bad goes down there, a revolution, that it'll spread for sure. And so I think that Europe really is at a brink of some kind of change that I think we cannot predict at this moment. But if you look at, experiences that we've had in 1848, the French Revolution, even, events from the 1930s, 1960s, that the, social revolt can escalate into something that really escapes control. And then there's no telling what might happen next. But my prediction at this moment would be that in another 10 years, there will be no European Union, and that there will be no NATO. And so we're going to be looking at a very different security architecture on the continent. And we're probably going to get countries going back to, nationalism and sovereignty. And, maybe that's for the better. For sure, we are now on an unsustainable path, and sooner or later, something will break.
I've seen lots of news stories recently about mobilization drafting efforts and what look like future drafting efforts in various European countries. And it seems like a lot of these efforts are being aimed at Russia. So do you feel that what you just described of this political exhaustion and breakdown of structures in Europe, do you think that happens before potential further escalation with Russia?
Yeah, this is something that worries me a great deal, because I studied a little bit how World War II broke out and what preceded it. And what preceded it was a very similar process as we had in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. And the process entails first immiserating a nation, and then empowering certain extreme elements, fomenting fear of an outside enemy, and then investing a great deal of capital into the defense industry and into the military. And so this was done in Germany for many years before the outbreak of World War II, maybe as long as 10 years or even a little bit longer, with the DOS plan and the Young's plan, when American and British bankers were pouring, in today's money, tens of billions of dollars into the military and heavy industries in Germany. And then you also had a political process that favored these extreme elements, which ultimately resulted with bringing Hitler to power in 1933. And eventually, this was all moving towards a big war between Germany and Russia. The whole point was to fashion Germany into a bludgeon with which to attack Russia. And of course, once that happened, it wasn't just Germany attacking Russia. It was practically all of Europe. The troops that went on Russia, there was something like 3 million troops, the biggest invasion ever. But those troops came from also Czechoslovakia, Hungary, from Sweden, Finland, Norway, Spain, Italy, Croatia, from Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. So this was like it wasn't at all the sanitized version that we got from, History 101 or 102, whatever. And then a very similar process was happening in Ukraine, where again, you had an ongoing immiseration of Ukrainian people. So between 1991, their independence, and 2014, Ukraine was dead last in terms of GDP growth in the whole world. So over that 24-year period, Ukraine lost 25% of their GDP. It was one of the only 5 countries in the world that had negative economic growth between 91 and 2014. Interestingly, of those 5 nations, 3 were in Russia's southern underbelly. So Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Those 3 nations had the worst economic performance in the world. And then, obviously the NATO went in. They turned those nations into military outposts, and their job was to attack Russia eventually, which Ukraine did. Georgia, in the end, they had an abortive effort in 2000. When was it? 2005, 6. That didn't work out, but then they learned their lessons, and now Georgia is refusing cooperation to the West. But Ukraine, unfortunately, got destroyed. Anyway, that whole process now is having its beginnings in Europe. So we see the deindustrialization of Germany. We see deindustrialization of Italy and France. We see economic problems as far as the eye can see. We also see these little brown shirt movements emerge. And those movements are very important because they are the ones who a few years down the road might be terrorizing their own population and scooping up young men to deliver them into the meat grinder on the Eastern Front. We see all of those elements now happening in Europe. The reason why I'm not as pessimistic as I could be about this is because I think that people have really had it, and they're no longer buying into the narrative. They're no longer people in Europe no longer buy into the story that Russians are our enemies. Nobody's afraid of Russia invading. And so I really hope that this time around we are going to avoid another world war on the European continent.
Alex, I'd like to ask you now, I'd like to tap into some of your thinking in regards to potential commodity market disruption, because I heard you say in another interview, if I heard you correctly, that you estimate that there may be a Russian sweep across the southern portion of Ukraine over into Odessa, forming a land bridge. And if that were to happen, I understand that that would take away control of the Black Sea ports from the Ukrainian entity. And they are a major commodity exporter, food, grains, and other commodities. So if that were to happen, do you think that there would be a Western Empire response to that? I would assume that those strategists on the Western side would get very angered at that kind of outcome. And do you think it could, if there were to be a response, do you think it could go so far as to create a standoff in the Black Sea in terms of the Turkish Straits and bringing those commodities to market? With the Western side saying, well, if you're going to take away, access to these port facilities, we're going to block you in, so you can't bring your commodities to market. Well, is there any possibility of that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I think that people in the West can get angry all they want, but the problem is that there's nothing much that they can do about this. Okay, so first of all, there's no doubt in my mind that Russians are going to take control of the Black Sea coast one way or the other, and I tend to think that it's probably not going to be a military conquest. I think that they will, they will seek some kind of a deal through their armistice, through their peace negotiations, ultimately, that will give them administrative control of Odessa, and by virtue of that, the rest of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast. And then, they're going to demand that Ukrainians turn over people who were accused for the May 2014 massacre in Odessa and all the other, war crimes and other types of crimes. There's going to be a purge. And so this whole Ukrainian Nazi nationalist element is going to be purged, and the political process will be taken over by people who will look to Russia as their ally and their friend in the region, which means that Russia will, by proxy, be able to control Odessa and maybe Kiev and all of eastern Ukraine, east of Dnieper River. And so that being the case, that changes dramatically the strategic situation in the Black Sea. Now, Western powers might have the wet dream of blocking Russia in by, getting the Greeks or the Turks to block them in the Black Sea and not allow them to trade through the Bosporus Straits. But Russians have been very busy developing the north-south transport corridor between Russia through the Caspian region down to Iran and further to the Indian Ocean. And so this is being developed as we speak. It's not going to be easy for them to contain Russia, particularly because global markets need Russian, gas and oil and grains and all kinds of other exports, and they will, if they block them in the Bosporus, then it's only going to catalyze a much faster development of this NTCS, NSTC. I'm sorry, North-South Transport Corridor, and so it'll also weaken the Western powers' hands because their own transport corridor is through the Suez Canal, and so if the alternative trade route gets adopted, and it should be because it's cheaper and much faster than the route through Suez Canal, then they will, for a tactical gain, they will gain a strategic defeat. And then, in terms of forcing any kind of a solution. Well, you can see what they've achieved with their prosperity guardian in the Red Sea. The most powerful navies of the world cannot control the Houthis, right? And they have not been able to stop attacks on shipping traffic through the Red Sea. And how are they gonna control then Russia or Iran or India or any of these real powers in the region if they cannot control Yemen, the world's poorest country, and their military?
If I could ask you now, more broadly speaking, you have this specialized investment background, looking at financial markets and commodities too, of course. Given what we've talked about so far, do you see any major trends and potential black swans as a decent thing to throw in there too, in terms of the years ahead?
Well, I generally do buy into the commodity supercycle hypothesis. Yeah. So this hypothesis simply looks at the last 150 or so years cycles of commodity prices compared to prices of other assets. And so they constructed the chart of comparing commodity prices to equity prices, right? And so they show these very long cycles where commodity prices get relatively high compared to equity prices, and then they have a long cycle where they go down, and these cycles take apparently about 50 years to do a whole back and forth, right? And so according to that hypothesis, we have now reached a historical 50-year low. Well, I'm talking about, let's say, 2021. We've hit a historic low of commodity prices versus equity prices, right? And let's say that the ratio that they're looking at is at 0.5. And I think that they're basing this on Goldman Sachs commodity index versus S&P 500. Let's call it that. And so we have relatively high asset prices in terms of equities and relatively low commodity prices. And so now this ratio will reverse, and it has started to reverse in 2021, 2022, 22, 23, but it has barely moved at all. And its historical range normally, so I said we hit 0.5. Historical range should be, let's say, the target should be between 4 and 6, or it could be higher. So that means that either the equity prices are going to crash or commodity prices are going to go much, much higher. And I happen to believe that commodity prices are probably going to be going much, much higher. But we're talking about a process that might take about 10 to 25 years to unfold fully. What happened in 22 and 23 barely made a blip on this commodities to equities ratio chart. And so we're looking at a cycle where we can expect much, much higher prices of gold, silver, copper, energy, oil, natural gas, including also agricultural commodities. Now, one thing that I've learned very, very quickly in my career as a commodities trader, 25 years ago already, is that I cannot predict anything. I can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen, 6 months from now or 5 years from now. But one thing that I did learn is that markets tend to move in trends. And so usually what happens is that these large-scale price events unfold over a period of time, which can be weeks, it can be months, or it can be years. And then you get a very large price readjustment, but it doesn't happen from one day to the next. So, what you said was maybe a black swan event. You could call it that, but it's not something that happens from one day to the next. The oil just goes today from $80 a barrel to $120 or $200 a barrel. That might happen. It probably will happen, but it might happen over a period of years. So I think that when we talk about these great price changes, it's something that happens over a period of time, and it takes shape of trends. And so the model I have developed seeks to not to predict the trends, not to predict what might happen tomorrow or next year, but to simply react to price fluctuations as they unfold in the market in real time. And then at a certain point, it says like, this looks like an uptrend happening. And then you get signals to go long. Or if the price starts to, go lower, it says like, oops, looks like a downtrend. And then it gives you signals to go short. Now, many times, price starts to go up and you buy, but then it corrects back down and then you end up losing something. And so it's a question of navigating these price changes over a very long time, and making sure that when you catch that trend, that you make a lot more profits than you lose in these choppy periods where trends looks like it's taking off, but then it doesn't. It reverses back. And so it's a process, and it's designed to function in the long term, not necessarily giving you 1% or 2% return every month.
So Alex, I've got another question for you here, and I have to admit I have a bias in asking you this question, so I want the viewer to know that. I remember, starting back around 2019 or 18 or so, like I was seeing all these news stories about the war on coal, as I interpreted it at the time. Various financial institutions saying coal is destroying the planet. We are going to exit the coal financing business. These big investment banks abandoning and letting go of teams and abandoning efforts toward the finance of new hydrocarbon and coal mining projects, development stage or exploration stage, kind of things. And so as I was seeing these things, I thought, well, hey, that's great. If some, big groups out there decide to abandon efforts toward bringing production to market, that might increase the cost of capital, and that would make returns better for those fewer participants who stick around, to do it, and possibly higher prices, from a smaller amount of production in the future. And so now I've got this question for you. These characters that run organizations like the World Economic Forum, do you think that they actually want higher commodity prices or higher price inflation over time? It sounds silly to ask, but when I look at these things like ESG and agri-food emissions crackdowns, a lot of these efforts seem to suggest like, hey, don't bring your production to market, shut in your production of various commodities. And then that it makes me look at these activists, these likely very well-paid activists like Greta Thunberg and these Just Stop Oil folks. Do you think that there's some of these groups desire higher price inflation? What are your thoughts there? Or is that just in my mind?
Well, Tekoa, you're asking an excellent question, because actually we are perhaps the most poignant way of looking at this situation and analyzing markets is to try to discern the motivations of people who are running the show. And they are running the show, like by their own admission. You have central bankers who said, well, the way we're going to shape the world of tomorrow, referring to the Great Reset, is by allocating credit to people who are part of the solution and taking credit away from the people who are part of the problem. And so this was Mark Carney, by the way, former chief of the Bank of England, who is now some kind of a climate czar, I think. I don't really know what they want. I think that obviously inflation is one of the two possible escape routes for them. One of them is to crash the economy, and to pull the great taking, as David Webb termed it. I think politically they cannot do this. It would be too risky. The whole world would come down on them, because you can't really successfully conceal the flow of assets. There's a paper trail that, if they lost political control, that paper trail could be followed exactly to the ultimate beneficial owners, and then we would know exactly who's at the top of the pyramid. So that's not going to happen, I don't think. Inflation is the only way that they give themselves time, because inflation is a gradual process. 1970s inflation took 10 to 15 years, depending on how you measure it. This gives them time. It gives them maneuvering space. It gives them the ability to try to work out new solutions to their problems. So there's no doubt in my mind that they will take the inflationary route. And I think that inflation will take place through commodity price inflation. So I think that commodity price inflation is part of their desired scenario. But I also think that some of these plans and agendas that they are implementing are also part of misguided plans that they have forged, I would say, in the late 80s and early 90s. And they expected, it's very clear if you look at those plans, and we know something about them. It is very clear that they fully expected that after the end of the Cold War, they thought that they would enjoy their unipolar moment, that there would be no rivals. And so in that case, if you're controlling the economy of the whole world, you can force everybody to abandon coal and to go to wind turbines and solar panels. But if you lost control of a whole block, and then these people can, still fire up coal burning furnaces and have a burgeoning steel industry and have electricity generated by coal, well, then, all you've done is you've set yourself at a disadvantage. And now, you're, somebody's racing down the road in a supercar and you're racing down the road in a horse-drawn carriage. You're just going to lose, right? But then you ask yourself, can people be this stupid? And unfortunately, my conclusion is that yes, they can, because, they have this guy, Klaus Schwab, who is somehow in charge of these processes and these agendas. And I'm yet to hear anything that indicates that the man is smart. Everything I heard from him, his speeches, his interviews, his book, it all sounds very demented. But, what you learn in analyzing markets, history, investment performance, that groupthink, and delusional groupthink is absolutely real, and people will destroy themselves by marching forward on the basis of beliefs that, to anybody who looks from the outside, it's like, this is madness, this is obviously wrong, but they carry on anyhow, and I've seen, I haven't paid very, very close attention to coal, but I've paid closer attention to the oil markets and to, let's say, copper. And yes, it seems to me that they are trying to curtail production of all these commodities in the West. And yes, that's probably going to lead to inflation. And it's another contributing factor to the commodity supercycle. Is it smart policy? Is it a smart policy on their part? No, it isn't. It's absolutely suicidal. The fact that they're persevering on it is a mystery. It's really delusional. But they're doing it. They're clearly doing it. They're curtailing agricultural production. What are they going to achieve by that? Russia has become world's #1 exporters of wheat. And so what might happen is that one day the West is going to have to come with their hat in their hand and beg for grain from Russia. And then Russia will say, like, yes, sure, okay. But, you're going to have to cooperate with us on certain other things. And so that's how, that's how history changes.
So I'd like to ask you now, across the Atlantic, over in the U.S., your interpretation of the current U.S. political circumstance. It's changing rapidly by the day. Is there an element of danger, do you think, injecting itself into the environment? And what are some likely potential scenarios that you see going forward?
It seems to me that, the people that I call the imperial cabal, the people who control the Western Empire, that they are, for them, the United States is very important so long as they control it. So if they can use the United States to pursue their own agenda of global domination and have the American people fund hundreds of military bases around the world where they can control the flow of resources and make sure that those resources constitute the collateral of the Western banking establishments, and then they will continue to do that. But if the United States, democratically decides to ditch that role and to become a sovereign nation in charge of their own future, and they decide, hey, the future is, why not trade with this really, really prosperous bloc called the BRICS? Why not trade with them? Why not export to those countries? They have purchasing power. Why not do business with them? Why not cooperate rather than drain our substance and our wealth and our reputation in these insane imperial wars? well, then they would rather have the United States destroyed and partitioned. And so it seems to me that, and I really think that the global headquarters of the Western Empire is still the City of London. And so for the City of London, same as it was in the 1860s, either the United States is going to be an ally under London's control, or they'll try to partition it and turn it into, 2 or 3 or more weak client states that they can again rule and control through divide and conquer strategies, right? And so, currently they're being served well by the Biden administration, but they're very visibly panicked at the prospect of Donald Trump taking the presidency. And so you can see already there are certain forces in the United States that are, pushing towards the, hey, let's have Texas secede, let's have Florida secede, let's have United States be partitioned between the red and the blue states, or whichever. And so once more, I think that there's a risk of a civil war erupting in the United States. People who will be pro-union and people who will be pro-partitioning. And same as in 1860s, this civil war was not about the emancipation of slaves. This civil war was a major global geopolitical event where the British Empire wanted to partition the United States between the North and the South. They controlled the South. They encouraged the South to secede, in a very similar way as they are now. They have encouraged they encouraged Ukraine to take the fight to the Russians. And then, in the North, you had Abraham Lincoln, who was fighting for preserving of the Union. And, what happened there is that Russia intervened. This has been airbrushed from our history lessons, but Russia intervened at the crucial moment of the Civil War in 1863. And the Russian Tsar Alexander II sent his Baltic fleet to New York and his Pacific fleet to San Francisco, where they anchored for 6 months. And in this way, they prevented France and Britain from intervening in the U.S. Civil War on the side of the South. Had that happened, the history would have been very, very different. United States would probably not remain a union. We would have probably some kind of a balkanized collection of independent states there, and history would have looked very, very different. I think we're approaching the same juncture, and I think that the same vested interest now will sooner break up the United States than allow United States to become once more an ally of Russia, because the United States was an ally of Russia throughout the 19th century. And otherwise, they will attempt to keep control of the American political process by hook or by crook. And we see that happening. I think that after what happened with the Biden exiting the presidential race and them doing the switcheroo and having Kamala Harris take over as the Democratic Party's candidate, in spite of there being no primary elections, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, it's very clear that they're trying to do everything to retain political control of the United States, but it doesn't look like they're going to be successful, And so Plan B, I think, again, is going to be an attempt to partition the United States, and we'll see what happens. Maybe, again, Russia might intervene and help the United States remain a union, as they did in 1860s. But we'll find out. I think that, history changes, and I think that I can see why Russia wanted to preserve the United States as an ally and as a union, as a strong country. But I don't know if that's true anymore. I think they might want that, but they might not care either, because they're no longer looking to the United States as an anchor. They're looking to China and the Eurasian powers like Iran, Belarus, ultimately even Ukraine, India, as the anchors of the future global security architecture. So we'll find out. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to predict.
So if a political leadership establishes itself in the U.S. That seeks to sort of move away from the global policeman role, or the global military muscle role, and focus on America first, or business relationships with BRICS countries and things, you'd expect the jar to be shaken, so to speak, with the ants. And
Yes, I absolutely do. I absolutely do, and I think that if you pay attention to the news flow, you will see every so often again these incipient brown shirt movements. You'll get these Patriot Front, I think they're called, and there are other groups who march. They make themselves very visible. They have matching uniforms. They have covered faces, and the narrative, their slogans, their placards, they all read something relatively reasonable that might even seem attractive to American patriots, but that it's a trap. It's an incipient brown shirt movement, and in the same way that I see these globalist powers begin to fashion Europe into a bludgeon against Russia, they also want to use the United States as a bludgeon against China. And so there's going to be a lot of social upheaval. And I think that it'll be very, very important for people to try to be as informed as possible and to try to resist these, how do you call it, this jingoist slogans that, we have to go fight China in the Pacific, or we have to fight Russia, or I don't know what. But, they will definitely be working on the United States to the detriment of the American people and to the detriment of a more, let's say, healthier and more prosperous future for the United States.
Alex, for the person watching who's really enjoying your comments and your grasp of history, could you point out a couple, if any come to mind, historical events that might be underrated or not well understood, that the listener or viewer should go learn about in terms of understanding what's going on today?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think that one of the lessons of history that would be important to know is the truth about the Civil War in the United States. And I have published an article on my blog a few years ago, but I'm actually now tempted to republish it again on my Substack. And it's important to understand because I studied in the United States. I sat through 2 semesters of American history, and I walked away with an impression that the Civil War was really about the emancipation of slaves. It was no such thing. It was completely different. So understanding actually that episode is very important to understand what's going on today. Also, another lesson of history that is important to know is the appeasement episode, right? 1938, which is one of the moments that catalyzed the escalation to World War II. And so this is again being sold to us as Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, has started a peace mission trying to end the war in Ukraine, and he's being attacked by the establishment politicians in Europe. And he's being attacked by calling his peace mission appeasement. This is what Ursula von der Leyen accentuated twice in her speech after she won another 5-year term as a president of the European Commission. And so appeasement is another lesson of history that has been completely misrepresented to the public. And I that's another article that I'm going to republish, but it's also there on my blog. I think the title is something that the shocking truth about the 1938 Munich Agreement, because that's where Neville Chamberlain had got Hitler to sign some kind of an agreement where Czechoslovakia was partitioned and blah blah blah. It's there's a lot there, but what we know about that episode now is that it was completely orchestrated by the British Secret Service and the British diplomacy, not just Neville Chamberlain, but a small cabal of actors around him like Lord Earl Grey and Lord Halifax and a number of other actors who were acting on someone's behalf, right? They didn't come up with that all on their own. And what else? Well, I think a lot of history is important to understand, including the role of oligarchies in the development of Western civilization and Western society, the empires, British Empire, French Empire, the Belgian colonies, even the United States, the Western Empire of today. And I published, bits and pieces about that on my Substack, but I will publish a major article on this subject as well over the coming days. So I think that one is also very important to appreciate.
So I'm going to try to get a link to that article and put it underneath this video so people can click on that and read it. So Alex, in addition to our viewers going to your Twitter page, which I'm going to link to too, and subscribing and learning about your services with Krainer Analytics and the Trend Compass reports, I'd like to ask quickly, what do you think are some simple, concrete steps that a person can do to increase the likelihood of their survival and of doing well in the months and years ahead and potentially the turmoil that we've discussed?
Sure. So I'll start with the most important bit, and that is local networking. Get to know your neighbors. Cultivate the relationship of trust and mutual support in your local communities. Support those who are doing useful things like, I don't know, raising chickens, producing eggs, cultivating orchards and growing vegetables and so forth. Gift economy between people in local community is probably the easiest way to attain a very, very high degree of resilience. I think that you want to also maybe own a little bit of gold and silver in physical form. So, not something in some vault somewhere, but something that you can actually have in your pocket and run with. I'm not mentioning that as an investment speculation, but it's something that just will give you extra maneuvering space if, say, tomorrow you want to leave the country and maybe you have to bribe an official to get your passport or to board a plane or a ship or a bus, whatever, or if you need a place in a hospital. But, we're not talking about large amounts of money. I would say a few months worth of your expenses. Have some food reserves, a pantry of foods that don't easily spoil. Wherever possible, downsize, reduce your overhead, make sure that your living expenses are that you can bring them down, because once inflation takes off properly, well, it already has, but we haven't seen nothing yet. It's the expenses that often end up killing people, not physically. I mean, economically, people end up, you're paying for things, and the cost of all those things keep going up and up and up, and your revenues are not going up and up and up. And so you want to downsize, you want to reduce your overhead as much as possible, simplify, get rid of your electric car and have like a reliable internal combustion engine car that's economic and easy to maintain. Get rid of cars with too much electronics in them, and that would be the big items, the advice that I might give people. And then if you have an investment portfolio that you want to protect the value of, do consider exposure to commodity prices, because that's what's going to be moving over the next 10 to 25 years. And so the way to capture some profits from those moves is to simply have exposure to those prices as they rise, which you can do through futures, mini futures, ETFs. I think in the United States, the CFDs are illegal, contracts for differences, right? But they are available to European investors, and they make it easy to gain exposure to commodities, because you don't have to buy a whole futures contracts like 1,000 barrels of oil or 100 ounces of gold. You can buy a single ounce of gold, a couple of barrels of oil, and so forth. So you can gain that exposure. But I think, again, the most important thing for your personal survival and resilience is your local community. People who know how to fix cars, people who know how to grow food, produce eggs, milk, cheese, things like this. I often hear people talking about communities of like-minded individuals, and that's very nice. We like to spend evenings talking with like-minded individuals, but you also don't want to find yourself in a community of former stockbrokers or bankers, because eventually you might need somebody who knows how to fix a leaky roof or a car that's broken down, to butcher an animal, things like that. And maybe a community of former stockbrokers is not going to be very resilient in this respect.
All right, Alex. Last question, I promise, and that is that. So I did try to get a copy of one of your books. Yeah, I wasn't able to get a copy of it, because I live in the U.S. And so, which of your books do you think are not banned in terms of people actually being able to get delivery of it? Whether they're in the U.S. or Western Europe, because I understand that the reality that you describe in some of your written books, there's been a block put on that, I think, through Amazon and other distributors.
Well, Amazon canceled me completely, so nothing is available through Amazon. And so what I've done is, because Amazon, once they canceled me, they continued to sell my commodities trading books, but they put them on something like $900, almost $1,000 a copy, except none of it went to me. And so I put up both of my commodities trading title on my website, and they're available as free downloads. And I have to say this, they're not free because they're crap, because my first book even got an award as the best book for best book on commodities for investors and traders by financialexpert.co.uk. So it's a good title. I would actually recommend more the Trend Following Bible, because it's a more recent title and, to my mind, a better text. It didn't get any awards, but I think it's a better book to read. And they don't exist in hard copy anywhere. I cannot provide any hard copies, but people can download a free PDF from my website. And then the geopolitical book called The Grand Deception, which is about historical relations between Russia and the United States, some of the stuff that we've discussed today. It's available from Red Pill Press, and they can ship it in hard copy. But if you're in the United States, you can receive a copy from Canada. If you're in Europe, there's a European website, because the shipping costs can be very expensive, so they, depending on where you are, you want to order it either from their Canadian site or from their European site. So that one is available, but only from the publisher itself. It's not available in any bookstores or Amazon or Barnes and Noble. That book actually got banned. And it got banned very quickly after it was published.
All right. Well, there are links to those, to where people can get those books right underneath that video, or the PDF documents. Alex Krainer, publisher of the Trend Compass Reports and founder of the Krainer Analytics. Thank you very much for sharing your comments with us today.
Thank you very much, Teco. It was a pleasure to join you today.